The age of Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith was 62. He was a very active man at a time when most guys think about retiring. Despite his grandfatherly demeanor, he had a terrible temper and was the best Marine in the Pacific. Smith became known as Howlin' Mad as a result. This would be his final mission as a Marine after 40 years, but it would not be simple. The Commander-in-Chief of the United States, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, sent Smith a telegram in October 1944. Pacific Fleet alerting him to the impending invasion of Iwo Jima, a Pacific island occupied by the Japanese. Operation Detachment was its code name, but the people who fought there just called it Iwo. Smith sent the 5th Marine Amphibious Corps, VAC, Commanding General Major General Harry Schmidt, instructions to start preparing for the attack. In the initial assault, Schmidt would deploy his 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, which were undergoing training in Hawaii. Major General Clifton B. Cates commanded the 4th Division, while Major General Keller E. Rocky commanded the 5th. Under the command of Major General Graves, B. Erskine, the 3rd Marine Division served as Corps Reserve and participated in mop-up operations on Guam. If the Allies were to defeat the Japanese Empire, Iwo Jima had to be taken. During the summer, General Henry A. Army Air Corps, Hap Arnold, quickly realized how important it was. Compared to the B-17 flying fortresses, which had a range of 2,400 miles, the new B-29 Superfortress heavy bombers had a range of almost 3,000 miles and could carry twice as many bombs. Arnold required an emergency airport for the damaged aircraft returning from bombing sorties over Japan, but he was eager to use the B-29s to attack Japan. The most likely location would be Iwo Jima. Iwo was on the line that Arnold drew connecting Japan and the Marianas. Iwo Jima looked like a pork chop from the air. It was 5 miles long and 2.5 miles wide at its widest point, making it somewhat smaller than 8 square miles. It was a desolate area with few people living there before to the start of World War II. Ash and cinder made up the soil from the beaches to the Motoyama Plateau, which lies close to the island's center. It was made up of a yellowish clay-like material that was unsuitable for any kind of agriculture when facing north. A sulfur refinery that emitted a pungent, overpowering rotten egg stench was the island's staple. Iwo Jima was hence also known as Sulphur Island. In 1891, Iwo Jima joined the Japanese Empire. It is part of the Nanpo-Shoto chain, which is a group of islands formed thousands of years ago by active volcanoes that rose out of the ocean. Tokyo recognized the significance of Iwo Jima after Saipan fell and defended the island with troops and supplies to fend off the impending invasion. An intelligent, creative leader, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, was chosen to hold this important position. He commanded about 21,000 men on the little island. In addition to various machine gun and rocket companies and naval soldiers, his units included the 109th Division, the 145th Regiment, the 17th Independent Mixed Regiment, the 26th Tank Regiment, the 2nd Mixed Brigade, and the Brigade Artillery Group. When Kuribayashi arrived, he was disappointed to see how badly organized the island's fortifications were. He opted for an alternative tactic to thwart the landing. He chose to excavate tunnels, gun emplacements, observation stations, supply dumps, and even hospitals entirely underground, ignoring the customary banzai charges. He would let the waves of assault to land move a few hundred yards inland and strike them with all his might. 10 13mm machine guns, 10 25mm anti-aircraft guns, and 2 6-inch guns taken from a cruiser made up the horseshoe-shaped heavy artillery position in the north. The Heavenly Mountain Battery was its nickname. In the summer, newly developed rocket weapons came. There were 2 sizes, a 16-inch round fired from a wooden chute and an 8-inch round fired from a barrel that could be quickly disassembled and transported to a different place. Their respective ranges were 2,000 and 3,000 yards. 6 more 75mm mountain guns were placed in the northwest part, centered on Hill 362A in July 1944. Additionally, a number of 47mm cannon were placed nearby. The caverns, gullies, ravines, and gorges that dot Iwo's northern terrain were home to machine guns, automatic weapons, and sniper holes. Kuribayashi established his headquarters at Kitano Point in the island's far north. It was a masterwork of engineering. There was 500 feet of tunneling in every direction. His strategy and planning chambers were constructed 75 feet below the surface. The communication blockhouse was the sole building above ground. It was 150 feet long and 70 feet wide, with reinforced concrete walls and a ceiling that were 5 to 10 feet thick. To manage and coordinate all of the artillery fire, the Japanese constructed a second communication center closer to the island's center. The beaches where the Marines would land on the plateau would be covered with additional field pieces and artillery. Iwo Jima had an incredible total of 26 kilometers of passages. Mount Suribachi, an extinct volcano 554 feet high, towered above the southern tip of Iwo Jima. It featured 7 stories of caverns and tunnels and was armed with every weapon the enemy possessed. Any available material that could be seized was used to brace all of these, including logs, driftwood, and even pieces of broken airplanes. The constant heat and sulfur fumes near the volcano made it impossible for the Korean workers to work for more than 15 minutes at a time. Many of the chambers were equipped with water, electricity, and multiple exits to avoid the flamethrowers the leathernecks would undoubtedly use against them. To make the attackers even more frustrated, cave openings were tilted at a 90-degree angle. To let the steam and sulfur smells escape into the atmosphere, all of the living spaces were vented. The entire area of Iwo Jima had been turned into a death zone. By early February 1945, Iwo's fortifications were almost complete. Kuribayashi felt he would lose despite his strong fortifications as the invasion date drew closer. But for every yard of Japanese soil the Marines stole, he was going to make them pay with their lives. The size of the naval and marine forces that were gathered for the invasion was unheard of in the Pacific War. The number of warships would be close to 800. LSTs, landing ship, tank, LSMs, landing ship, mechanized, transports, cargo, and auxiliary vessels of various kinds, 8 battleships, 12 aircraft carriers, 19 cruisers, and 44 destroyers were among them. There were over 7,000 Marines. The Navy and U.S. over 100,000 soldiers made up the force and Army personnel. The liberation of Iwo Jima was planned strategically up to October 24, 1944, when a major disagreement about pre-invasion bombardment arose between the Navy and Marine Corps. Schmidt wanted to use 3 battleships and various cruisers for 10 days. The commander of Task Force 51, Admiral Richmond K. Turner, received this request. They rejected it. Turner wanted only 3 days because he believed a lengthy shelling would take away the element of surprise. This was absurd. The Japanese were well aware that Iwo Jima was being approached by a sizable assault force. An additional request for 9 days of bombing was made on November 8, 1944. It was turned down as well. The first 3-day plan would remain in place. In actuality, the Navy intended to use Task Force 58's strength to attack Japan during the Iwo campaign, mostly to counteract the negative publicity the Army Air Force's B-29s were getting. The Navy aimed to prove that its aircraft deployed on carriers were just as powerful as the widely reported bombers. Howlin' Mad was incensed. He did not want his men to suffer any significant hardships as a result of inter-service rivalry. He argued the point all the way to the operation's overall commander, Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. The Marines only asked for 4 days this time, but their request was denied once more. Smith was devastated. The dead of hundreds of Marines floating in the lagoon at Tarawa in November 1943 were too vivid for him to forget. He believed that these troops had perished needlessly since the enemy defenses had not been eliminated as intended by naval gunfire. The Leathernecks would have to settle for 3 days until renowned Marine historian Colonel Robert Heinel wrote years later that the cancellation of the extra shelling of Iwo Jima was a costly irony. Schmidt decided to make the landings on the eastern beaches. The Navy did not like the surf conditions on the western side of the island, despite the fact that the western approaches were debated and first authorized. Although this provided the Japanese with good fields of fire on the landing craft, transporting the assault troops to the beaches The Marines reluctantly consented. Each landing zone was separated into portions of 500 yards each, for a total of 3,000 yards. The 5th Marine Division's 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 28th Marines would land on Green Beach, which lies closest to Mount Suribachi. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 27th Marines, 5th Marine Division would then land on Red 1 and 2 and take control of Motoyama Airfield No. 1. The 4th Marine Division's 1st and 2nd Battalions, 23rd Marines, would wheel right on Yellow 1 and 2 and attack Motoyama Airfield No. 2. Finally, immediately after landing, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 25th Marines, 4th Marine Division, would make a sharp right turn and advance on the quarry. The 3rd Marine Division and the other battalions would be placed in reserve. Admiral William R. P. Blandy and his Task Force 52 had already begun the 3-day preliminary bombing of Iwo Jima as the assault teams steam-headed toward their target. At the same time, Admiral Mark Mitcher's task force was undertaking a carrier strike only 60 miles off the coast of Japan. 6 battleships and 5 cruisers made up Blandy's armada, which started shooting methodically and carefully at pre-selected targets. With unsatisfactory outcomes, the fleet withdrew to sea at the end of the day. Their shelling had suffered under the cloudy skies. The UDTs, underwater demolition teams, started working the next morning. The risky duty of clearing any mines or other obstacles that might impede the landing was assigned to the frogmen. To cover the UDT squads, LCIs, landing craft infantry, were equipped with 20mm and 40mm gun. The Japanese fired on the feisty ships as they approached the coast. The small boats zigzagged in an attempt to dodge the German gunners as they dropped off the frogmen. 9 of the 12 ships engaged were completely destroyed, and all 12 were hit by artillery. By the end, 43 people had been killed and 109 wounded by the LCIs, and another 7 people had been killed and 33 wounded by one of the destroyers. The beaches were deemed adequate for landing after the bombing's second day. First blood had been drawn by the Japanese. The main objectives on the final day of bombing were the Suribachi base and the artillery that guarded the approach routes. The small island was bombarded by the large weapons from 7:45 a.m. till 6:30 p.m. that day. At the end of the day, the Navy was hopeful and estimated that half of Iwo's fortifications had been destroyed or damaged. Not much was done in the north. In order to inform Admiral Turner that his duty was finished and that another day of bombing would be ineffective, Admiral Blandy radioed him. The Navy had served its time. The Marines now had the final say. On the morning of Monday, February 19, 1945, the drab, hazy sky over Iwo Jima turned azure blue at dawn. The Marines were waiting to board their landing craft on the decks of the different transports, combat-loaded. A gentle breeze was blowing, the sea was tranquil, and the temperature was a comfortable 70 degrees. The day was ideal for an invasion. The pre-H hour shelling started at 6:40 a.m. In 80 minutes, 2 battleships on the west coast and 5 on the east coast fired 75 rounds each. Concussions from the 16-inch salvos caused Iwo to rock. In addition to the destroyers firing their 5-inch rounds, 100 rounds of 8-inch shells were launched by 4 heavy cruisers and 3 light cruisers. Many veterans from earlier battles knew the Japanese would be waiting, despite the fact that the bombing was an amazing sight. The chaplain performed the 23rd Psalm and requested a minute of quiet as they got ready to cross the gunnels into the waiting landing craft. Corpsman Greg Emery of the 28th Marines wished he had picked something a bit more upbeat as they began their descent. He was upset by the portion about the Valley of Death. The LVTs, amphibious tractors, were to be attacked by more Marines. The Navy coxswains who led the ships to shore turned on the engines as they descended the slender metal ladders below deck. The foul stench of the vapors released by the craft soon filled the ship's hold. The departure line was set up a few miles out to sea. An air raid consisting of 120 carrier planes flew overhead in 2 columns just after 8 a.m., dropping napalm on their initial run. The Marines let out a loud chorus of shouts when the jelly and gasoline concoction exploded, producing enormous billowing clouds of flames and extreme heat. As they bombarded the sandy shoreline with strafing runs and rocket fire, The planes quickly returned with orders to scrape their bellies on the beach. The fleet continued its bombardment once the fighters had completed. The Navy fired more than 8,000 rounds at Iwo Jima in all. The primary control ship dropped her ensign just after 8:30 a.m. 68 LVTs equipped with 75mm howitzers trailed closely behind the rocket-manned LCIs. The ships started running frantically toward the beachhead. After firing 2,000 missiles, the rocket boats veered to the right and left to make room for the amphibious tractors to reach the shore. The naval gunners started focusing their weapons in a rolling bombardment on inland targets just before 9 in the morning. More fighters swooped in, dropped their cargoes, and then peeled out over the sea when it was over. The first Marine landed on Red Beach 1 at 8:59 a.m. The United States had landed in Japan. The rest of the waves rolled ashore in quick succession, moving toward the wave-cut terraces that threatened them. 3 terraces total, one immediately following the other, were created by strong storms that deposited loose ash into 10 to 15-foot heaps several years prior. Airfield number 1 was situated on the plateau that extended from the shore. Infantrymen quickly learned how difficult it was to move about in the volcanic ash. PFC Company E, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines. Mortarman Fred Walsack was worn out by carrying the weapon's excess weight and the extra rounds. "God damn this ash," he muttered to himself as he sank ankle-deep in the loose clay. "This ash, god damn it." For the first half hour ashore, enemy activity had been surprisingly low. The resistance had been limited to the occasional mortar blast and some intermittent automatic weapons fire, but that was going to change. The Japanese suddenly came alive. Before launching their assault, they had let the Marines throng the beaches. Mortars and fire rained down on the Marines from the north and from atop Suribachi. There simply wasn't enough space to make any kind of tactical move. There was nothing to be done but to proceed, as one participant put it. Foreground lines, goddamn front lines are non-existent. The entire island is in the front line. Company B, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, had arrived at the western beaches by late morning and had effectively cut off Suribachi from the remainder of the island. Individual Marines fighting with just rifles, grenades, flamethrowers, and satchel charges fought without tank or artillery assistance. Eliminated pillboxes unexpectedly reanimated and fired from behind at advancing leathernecks. Kuribayashi's underground fortifications were operating flawlessly and causing the Marines to suffer a great deal of losses. Company B platoon commander Lieutenant Frank Wright had begun the day with 60 soldiers. There were only 2 left. Despite suffering a severe wound on his throat, Captain Dwayne Mears encouraged his men to continue. One of the fortunate ones was Corporal William Faulkner of Company C, who was thrown backward into a bomb crater after a shell detonated in front of him. His helmet was dented by a piece of shrapnel, but he was unharmed. The beach conditions were getting worse. The trucks, jeeps, LVTs, tractors, and amphibious tractors were the targets of a significant amount of the Japanese ordnance. Congestion was exacerbated by the dead bodies of sailors and Marines floating aimlessly in the waves. Tanks and howitzers were trying to reach land. In order to support the assault companies and bring the equipment inland, a concerted effort was being made to clear routes. At midday, the 5th Marine Division's 31st Seabees successfully landed the first bulldozer. Seaman First Class Ben Massey, who was operating it, was shot in the neck shortly after. Mate Hollis Cash, the machinist, leaped into the seat and started working the machine. Vehicles stuck in the moist volcanic ash were pulled out by cranes and caterpillars. As enemy rounds continued to explode among them, Navy beachmasters were yelling commands into their bullhorns. The LSM of machinist, Mate First Class Alpenix, Bernard grounded in the damp sand. He readied himself to remove his caterpillar as quickly as possible as the ramp descended. His departure from the spaceship was preceded by that of the bulldozers and tanks. He saw the dead people's bodies in front of the boat as he staggered ahead. He clenched his teeth and drove over them, not daring to look. He kept telling himself that, in order for the tanks to advance, he needed to flatten the terraces and get ashore. In the meantime, The sector of the 4th Marine Division was significantly worse. The worst positioned unit was the 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines. From the north, they were close to the ridge nearest the beach. Major General Clifton B. Cates stated, "Before we enter, I would suggest that the man on the far right of the right-hand squad of the right-hand company of 325 be awarded a medal if I knew his name." Like all activity on Iwo, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 25th Marines were moving very slowly as they attempted to reach the ridge and cliff region. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 23rd Marines were encountering strong Japanese fortifications, guarding the 1st airfield to their south. One pillbox was circumvented by 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines Sergeant Darrell Cole, who then slid explosives through the openings. An opposing grenade hit close him, quickly killing him as he crawled back to his lines and picked up more grenades before going back to the concrete structure to repeat the action. The Medal of Honor was given to him posthumously. The D-Day carnage was horrifying. Kuribayashi had carried out his plan precisely. He had allowed the Marines to land, moved 500 yards inland, and then opened fire. The majority of the remains were terribly damaged because of the huge caliber of the firearms. Human remains, including heads, arms, and legs, were strewn across a wide region. One Marine was disemboweled by enemy shrapnel. His pinkish entrails resembled a gigantic earthworm in the ash. While in reserve, one company had 30 casualties. No sanctuary existed. One of them was on the beach, lying prone, when a shell rubbed under him. He was hurled 50 feet into the air by the ensuing explosion. His crumpled body remained on the shore, lifeless, after he landed with a thump. The body of Gunnery Sergeant John Manila John Bazzalone of the 1st Battalion, 27th Marines, was found face down in the sand somewhere on Red Beach 1. On Guadalcanal, Bazzalone received the Medal of Honor and was removed from combat to participate in war bond drives. The New Jersey native requested to be sent back to a line company because he did not enjoy the easy duty. He was killed in battle on the first day of Iwo Jima, fulfilling his wish. The Navy Cross was given to him posthumously. Medical professionals were overtaxed. The enemy's weapons did not spare doctors or corpsmen. 2 physicians and 16 corpsmen were slain in one region. At the end of the day, another medical detachment that had arrived with a complement of 26 personnel had lost 11. Time Life journalist Robert Sherrod called the first night on Iwo Jima a nightmare in hell. The battlefield appeared surrealistic due to the lighting shells fired by the destroyers. Iwo appeared to be another planet to one Marine. Clifton Cates, a major general, wished he had 4 more hours of daylight, or even 6. Concerned about his artillery unit, the 14th Marines, which had not yet landed, he thought, hell, I'd compromise for 2. Fortunately, by dusk, the 75mm and 105mm artillery were ashore. Some of its pieces had also been landed by the 5th Division's artillery unit, the 13th Marines. When the onslaught continued in the morning, both units would be desperately needed. The 3rd Division's 9th and 21st Regiments were steaming toward Iwo Jima. Soon, the 3rd Regiment would arrive. There were now close to 3,000 troops on the beach. An island only 8 square miles in size was home to an astounding 5,000 men. Smith hoped for a banzai attack called Howlin' Mad, but it never materialized. For that, Kuribayashi was too sage. Throughout the night, he harassed the exhausted Marines by sending out wolf packs, which were squads of 2 or 3 men. As the 1st Battalion, 28th Marines attempted to reach Caetano Point, sections of the unit destroyed an enemy surge that contained about 40 personnel. The intensity of the German artillery fire escalated later that evening, leading to the closure of yellow and blue beaches. As they passed overhead, the 675-pound spigot mortar shells made a loud, constant shriek. The odd weapon left a trail of crimson flame behind it, and most Marines looked at curiously. The rest of the Japanese armament was deadly, but fortunately it was not very accurate. The commander of the 28th Marines, Colonel Harry the Horse Liversedge, was bent over his charts, getting ready for the assault the next day. He looked over the charts and concluded that while it would be difficult for his soldiers to capture Suribachi, It was crucial that it be done so as soon as possible to support the armies moving north. The man from Volcano, California, was ironically targeting a volcano in the morning. On February 20th, 1945, the dawn was gloomy, chilly, and depressing. Every unit was ready for the assault. The Marines of the 26th and 27th were prepared to advance across the west coast. The 23rd, 24th, and 25th regiments advanced up the east coast on their right flank. The 28th Marines surrounded Suribachi to the south. Pillboxes, tunnels, bunkers, blockhouses, anti-tank trenches, machine gun emplacements, and mortar pits totaling 1,300 yards had to be broken through. Carrier planes bombed and strafed Suribachi's base just before the jump. The 13th Marines added rounds, and mine layer Thomas E. Fraser added further firepower. Lieutenant Colin Chandler's Johnson's 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines began their advance on Suribachi at 8:30 a.m. Lieutenant Cole Charles Shepard's 3rd Battalion, 28th Marines, was to their right. Sparse patches of underbrush and ragged shattered boulders around the mountain's base. The bulk of the enemy's armaments were situated on a green border that skirted the foundation. There was the harsh crack of the destroyer's 5-inch shells. They fired up to 200 yards from the Marine lines and more than 1,500 rounds into the slope. The assault was led by demolitions and flamethrowers, with the 2nd Battalion alone blasting nearly 40 caves closed. In order to improve accuracy, the 3rd Battalion, 13th Marines moved their 75mm howitzers and 37mm half-tracks closer to the infantry by late morning. The enemy defenses were much stronger than anticipated, Johnson said in a letter sent to division headquarters. Every 10 feet was a pillbox. Although the support provided was adequate, few pillboxes or caves were destroyed. Groups had to take them one step at a time while suffering significant losses. While the 5th Division was struggling towards Suribachi, the 4th Division was also struggling. Numerous officers lost their lives. A mortar round struck the command post, CP, of the 2nd Battalion's 25th Marines, killing its commander, Lieutenant Cole, Lewis C. Hudson, Jr., its executive officer, Major William P. Kempfer, and its operations officer, Major Donald K. Ellis. Additionally, an artillery shell killed 6 corpsmen from the 1st Battalion, 25th Marines. 7 additional people were also seriously injured by the round. No one was spared by enemy gunfire. With the help of tanks from the 4th Division, the 23rd Marines captured the airstrip by early afternoon, despite the intense shelling. Against Suribachi, however, the 28th Marines had only advanced 200 yards. It was difficult, time-consuming, and extremely depressing. Kuribayashi sent a message to his mountain-defending soldiers. First and foremost, Iwo Jima must be fiercely defended. The second is to destroy opposing personnel and weaponry. Third, one must use rifle and sword assaults to eliminate every enemy soldier. Fourth, every bullet must be fired to its target. Fifth, one must continue to use guerrilla tactics to disturb the adversary, even if he is the last guy standing. This was Suribachi's most recent message. An 1.5-inch thick cable was discovered and swiftly severed by Marines from the 5th Engineer Battalion. Inside the mountain citadel, the enemy was genuinely cut off. By the end of the day, the Leathernecks had about 1/4 of the island. The 4th Division suffered 2,000 killed and wounded, while the 5th Division lost another 1,000 men. James V. Forrestal, the Secretary of the Navy, watched the combat from the flagship El Dorado. He was rendered speechless by the terrible agony. LST-779 delivered the first of the V Amphibious Corps 155mm howitzers after squeezing through the debris on Red Beach 1. 4 of the large guns were ashore and prepared to bombard Suribachi by the end of the afternoon. The star shells filled the pitch-black darkness during the night. The force of the artillery booms caused the small island to quake. There were several enemy soldiers gathered in what looked like a banzai charge at the mountain's eastern flank. Henry A. Wiley, a destroyer, quietly moved within 200 yards and flooded the area with her 5-inch shells. The night on Iwo was long. On Iwo Jima, February 21st was a cloudy day. The mountain was battered by shells from the naval boats offshore and the roaring howitzers of the 13th Marines. As the assault troops were hit by flying boulders, soil, and other debris, the bombardment was dangerously near to them. Liversedge hoped it would be near. "Ask for everything, Pete," he said to Major Oscar Petros, his operations officer, "and tell those planes to drop it close. We can't use air tomorrow." There was a spooky silence on the lines as the planes began to peel off. Nothing occurred for a few seconds, then 1, 2, 3 guys got up and started going toward their target, followed by groups of Marines. The Marines started to zigzag along the 700-yard line in order to dodge the escalating enemy fire. While Lieutenant Cole Charles E. Shepard's 3rd Battalion launched itself into the heart of the volcano's defenses, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Butterfield's 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, advanced down the western beaches. Johnson's 2nd Battalion encountered obstinate opposition on the eastern side. The number of casualties started to rise. Over the clamor of combat, the word corpsman was heard. A shrapnel fragment fractured the jaw of Corporal Richard Wheeler of Company E, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines. Another Marine was wounded in the same shell hole by the same mortar round. Another mortar round exploded in the hole as pharmacist mate 3rd Class Clifford Langley was tending to their injuries. This time, the metal pieces cut Wheeler's calf muscle, causing a deep cut on his leg. Now the 2nd Marine lay on his stomach, bleeding profusely and without skin. Langley continued to focus on his wounds, ignoring them. Another mortar fell among them as he was doing this. As the missile buried itself in the loose ash, Wheeler and Langley looked on helplessly. They were relieved that it didn't explode. Around Suribachi, there was fierce warfare. As they edged closer to the peak, Marines using Browning automatic rifles, BRs, would execute a leapfrog action, with one firing forward and the other reloading. After a Marine shot the phone out of another Marine's hand, Private 1st Class Daniel Friday of Company E, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines rushed to the front of one tank to direct it. Standing in the open, the Arapaho Indian from Wyoming used hand and arm signals to guide the Sherman. Consequently, the tank's 75mm cannon fired precisely, destroying multiple pillboxes. The 28th Marines arrived at the base of Suribachi at the end of the day. The riflemen had destroyed many pillboxes and other buildings, and they had blasted hundreds of caves shut. The conflict was just as brutal to the north. Kuribayashi's primary defensive line was being confronted by the 4th Division. The 3rd Division's 21st Marines were ordered to reach ashore before dark. To launch an attack in the morning, they gathered close to Airfield No. 1. Condition Red was activated during the night when Japanese kamikazes attacked the USS Saratoga. The aircraft carrier was hit by 6 jets, but it remained afloat. The USS Bismarck Sea, the escort carrier, was not as fortunate. An explosion caused by a kamikaze hit destroyed the fire mains and made the plane elevator unusable. Aircraft that had been gassed on the flight deck quickly caught fire. After the ammunition started to cook off, the ship was finally ordered to abandon. More than 200 men were killed. It was a miserable day on Iwo on February 22nd. As the rain increased in intensity, the ash transformed into a slurry. Weapons wreaked havoc in the dense jumble. The thunder of artillery fire, the whoosh of flamethrowers, and the all-too familiar noises of the injured filled the air as the fighting restarted. Many of the infantrymen engaged the enemy in close combat as grenades were thrown at them from cave openings as they advanced. Because they were too close to the mountain, they could not get air or artillery backup. After landing, Major General Keller Rocky set up his division headquarters in a shell hole next to Airfield No. 1. The steady drone of the bulldozers preparing the 5th Division's cemetery could be heard while he and his crew combed over maps and plans. The gruesome chore of collecting the dead was given to men from Graves Registration, dressed in rubber aprons and wearing gloves that reached their armpits. Only a head or arm was discovered in certain instances. While their final resting places were being dug, bodies were stacked. The thousands of white crosses that would be placed on the graves were close by. Now that Suribachi was finally encircled, the only thing left to do was scale the summit and take it. However, all routes to the summit had been destroyed by the continuous bombing. As night fell, Liversedge suspended all fighting until daybreak, when the Marines would launch their last offensive against the volcano. There were only approximately 300 Japanese remaining from the combat force within the mountain. The other half chose to stay in battle to the death in the shadowy depths of Suribachi, while the other half attempted to rejoin other forces in the north. The weather on Friday, February 23rd, D+4, was slightly overcast. The sun broke through the clouds, and the rain had ceased. Suribachi was oddly quiet. The Japanese soldiers withdrew to the summit of the volcano to make their last stand, abandoning the defenses that around it. The massive shelling left its mark on the mountain. The gnarled remains of the massive naval cannons positioned there were visible on their scarred slopes. The tunnels were smoking, most of them now deserted. The plan of action was discussed at a meeting. Major Oscar Petros, an operations officer with the 28th Marines, recounted, "Colonel Liversedge and I visited the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines CP, and spoke with its commander, Lieutenant Coolidge Cheney Johnson, his executive officer, Major Tom Pierce, and his operations officer, Captain Martin Reineman. We underlined how important it was to inform the remaining soldiers that the mountain was safe. As a result, we discussed smoke pots and other topics before settling on Colonel Johnson's suggestion to raise a flag in a location that would be visible from all over the island. Johnson chose Company E because it was the most sensible path up the mountain on the northeast side. He told the company commander, Captain Dave Severance, who then selected the 3rd Platoon to be commanded by First Lieutenant Harold Schreier, his executive officer. Schreier's 40-man patrol began their ascent to the summit of Suribachi just after 8 a.m. Schreier gave the order for riflemen to defend their flanks on either side of the column. On their route to the crest, the Marines would pause for a quick rest because the additional equipment they were carrying caused them to slow down. In certain places, you had to climb on your hands and knees. One witness said, "Those guys should be getting flight pay." At 10 in the morning, Schreier's patrol arrived at the top. The ascent had gone well. Everyone looked around nervously, but there were no hostile soldiers to be seen. Schreier signaled that the patrol should stand on the outside rim. One Marine defied authority by urinating. Nothing happened yet. The rest of the patrol headed toward the center, while the other half covered the mountain's edge. When a Japanese soldier was sighted at one of the cave mouths, a gunfight broke out. In the meantime, 6 Marines fastened a drainage pipe to the U.S. flag Johnson had given them before they ascended. They lifted it at 10:20 a.m., the first Japanese land captured by American forces during World War II. Was photographed by Leatherneck Magazine's Staff Sergeant Lewis Lowry, but it would be forgotten hours later when Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal took the now famous image. But images meant nothing to the Marines on Iwo Jima. They just knew that Suribachi had been taken prisoner and that they could go north without worrying for their rear. The island exploded in a wild roar of bells, whistles, and foghorns as word got out. Lying on the deck of a hospital ship, a wounded Marine made a futile attempt to raise himself so he could see the flag better. He was not strong enough to yell. He sank back onto his cot and started crying. The battle was at a standstill to the north. The daily loss of 1,000 Marines, both dead and wounded, meant that gains were small. Airfield No. 2 was the scene of the most acrimonious combat. The heart of the island was pounded by shells, fired by the cruiser USS Pensacola and the battleship USS Idaho. Cates expressed dissatisfaction with the ordnance's performance and asked the U.S. heavy bombers from the Army were stationed in the Marianas to offer assistance. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 21st Marines stepped off to take control of the airstrip at 9:30 a.m. on February 24th. The field was surrounded by more than 800 enemy pillboxes. Companies Inspersten under the command of Surfaist Raoul Archambault began sprinting across the runway. After reaching the crest, the Marines launched a seesaw maneuver to maintain their position. They fell on coal in the midst of the frenzied fighting. In his book Iwo Jima, Richard F. Newcomb described how Ikeda's troops used rocks, rifle butts, bayonets, knives, pistols, and shovels. It was over in 90 minutes. The line had been broken, Archambault and his troops were atop the ridge, and the advance had progressed 800 yards. Tanks, bazooka men, mortar men, and machine gunners streamed through the opening, clearing the area as they went. The 24th and 25th Marines occupied Charlie Dog Ridge on the east coast, bringing them closer to the airstrip. The 9th Marines were tapped to land by the end of the 6th day. Only a third of the island was under Marine control, with over 1,600 people already dead and 4,500 injured. The 3rd Marines were the only remaining reserve. The 26th and 27th Marines engaged in brutal combat on the west coast around the end of February. Through a vicious crossfire, they faced hill after ridge. The 23rd, 24th, and 25th Marines were prepared to attack at Hill 3082, the second highest point on Iwo, while the 9th and 21st Marines faced Hills Peter and Obo. Hill 382 was a tangle of bunkers and pillboxes. Its crest had been excavated and equipped with gun pits and weaponry. The Turkey Knob, a little hill devoid of leaves, was to the right of this. Along with the standard defenses, there was a massive blockhouse that served as both a communications hub and an observation post. It was unaffected by 85 rounds fired from a 75mm howitzer. Minami came next. It was a nest of bunkers, once a tiny settlement. The amphitheater, a 300-yard-long by 200-yard-wide open bowl-shaped depression, completed this ring. The enemy launched satchel charges and grenades at the attacking Marines from the summits of these positions. Armored bulldozers made a valiant effort to remove boulders and other debris to make room for tanks to enter and support the infantry. In some regions, advancements were only measured in feet. Soon the region was known as the Meat Grinder. The 4th Division's 9 battalions threw themselves against the Meat Grinder. They had the location completely surrounded by dark on February 27th. But the price was high. Around 800 people died. Howlin' Mad Smith opposed Erskine's plan to include his 3rd Marines in the battle. He felt that the island was too crowded. At least outside the front lines, it was. After securing Suribachi, the 28th Marines went into reserve, but on March 1st, they launched an offensive against Hill 362A on the west coast. Upon reaching the summit, Marines from the 1st and 2nd Battalions encountered an 80-foot cliff. Nishi Ridge, an open region that the Japanese had encircled from all sides, was also in front. There were caverns, spider tunnels, and tiny alcoves where riflemen and automatic weapons were concealed along each approach. The advance was supported by Company C, 5th Tank Battalion. Flamethrower tanks were useful, but only 350 yards were reached due to the difficult terrain. On March 2nd, the assault on all fronts resumed. In the middle of the island, on Hill 362B, the 3rd Division launched an attack. The Leathernecks struggled in one section, known as Cushman's Pocket, named for Lieutenant Cole. Robert Cushman, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines. After securing it at last, they spent the following 2 weeks cleaning it. The 2nd Battalion, 24th Marines, also captured Hill 382. The amphitheater and the Turkey Knob had been destroyed by artillery and air fire. Combat engineers used more than a ton of demolitions to seal off caves and tunnels. However, the 4th Division alone had suffered almost 3,000 casualties as a result of the Meat Grinder. The 5th Division operated on the western side of the island, with the 28th Marines on the left and the 26th Marines on the right. In order to attack Nishi Ridge, the 21st and 2nd Battalions of the 28th Marines circled the flanks of Hill 362A. 4 distinct tunnel networks were discovered, including one that was more than 1,000 feet long and had 7 entrances. In a draw, tanks found it extremely difficult to navigate a section of anti-tank ditches, but they succeeded in blasting their way through to the rifle companies. There were fewer concrete buildings when the Marines were in the middle of natural rock formations. In this case, the enemy used the natural environment as cover. According to 1st Sergeant John Daskalakis of Company E, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, it was just a maze of tunnels and caves. It was fairly simple to lose each other's sight. At the northern end of the island, the soil was clay-like, grayish, and nearly marl-like. You had the Japanese behind you and beneath you. They shot men in the back. They possessed subterranean ammunition dumps, CPs, and hospitals. They were invisible to you. It made me think of Gettysburg's Devil's Den. A crippled B-29 hobbled into Iwo Jima as the Leathernecks closed in on the north. A couple mortar shells pounded behind her as she touched down, and the plane made a rough landing. The crewmen were slapped on the back by Marines and Seabees. The superfortress was winging its way back to Guam shortly after the plane was fixed. More than 24,000 crewmen were saved when more than 2,000 B-29s made emergency landings on Iwo Jima prior to the end of the war. The Marines were responsible for that. The Leathernecks fought with the remaining Japanese troops as the days went by. So far in the battle, only 80 detainees had been captured. 45 of these were Korean workers. The adversary was refusing to give up. A lot of Marines would pause to stare at the survivors. For many of them, it was their first real sighting of a Japanese soldier. When 1,000 of the enemy charged the 4th Division's Marines, they repulsed the only coordinated banzai attack on Iwo Jima. The waves of humans, some with just spears, were mowed down by machine gun and rifle fire. 784 bodies were counted once it was over. The Marines suffered about 300 injuries and 90 fatalities. However, organized resistance on the island's east coast came to an end as a result of the onslaught. The final Japanese stronghold was Kitano Point. Over 22,000 rounds were fired by the Corps Artillery's 155mm cannon and the 13th Marines' 75mm and 105mm howitzers just prior to the assault on it. The cruiser's 8-inch shells also contributed to the weakening of Iwo's western flank. The infantry was stopped close to the high land that stretched southeast from Kitano Point as the attack continued. Overlooking a deep gorge were the 28th Marines. It was the island's worst terrain. They dubbed it Death Valley. Because the terrain was so mountainous and narrow, heavy weaponry were impractical. Thus the 75mm and 37mm guns were used, a crucial position that controlled all accesses to the north. The 28th Marines cautiously ascended the gentle slope. The 27th Marines swung around from the west, and they were told to wait. Together, the 26th Marines would advance on the last remaining enemy bastion. The Marine divisions were wiped out by this point. Now, companies were platoon-sized and occasionally commanded by corporals. The nerves were tense. In order to support the weary men, artillerymen, cooks, and clerks were now being dispatched to the front lines. Casualties continued to arrive at the field hospitals with wounds that make you sick to look at. There were just 1,500 Japanese left out of the 21,000 at the beginning of the conflict. The situation is now on the brink of the last. I shall lead the final offensive, praying that our empire will eventually emerge victorious, was part of Kuribayashi's penultimate message to Tokyo. We are prepared for the last act now that the water has been used up and the bullets have been used up. That night, he gave the order to burn the 145th Infantry's flags. The formal flag-raising ceremony took place in the southern region of Iwo Jima on Wednesday, March 14, 1945. The faint sound of gunshots echoed in the background as Colonel Davis H. Stafford read the proclamation. While a 105mm gun roared nearby, a group of stretcher-bearers escorted a wounded Marine to a field hospital. There was still plenty of evidence of the battle. As Colors was played, a tight quiet descended upon the audience. As the flag on Suribachi was lowered, the one on top of an 80-foot pole was raised. There wasn't much conversation among the group when it was finished. "Howlin' mad," misty-eyed Smith remarked. This was the hardest yet. The island was formally proclaimed secure 2 days later. The Marines engaged in combat in Death Valley were taken aback. There, they would battle a recalcitrant enemy for 10 more days. The final attack by the Japanese on Iwo Jima took place early on March 26th. They gathered in the vicinity of Airfield No. 3 and stealthily moved southward along a track. They advanced to the tent area, where the Army Air Force soldiers and 5th Pioneer Battalion were billeted. These units were overrun in a matter of minutes, taking everyone by surprise. While they slept, airmen had their throats slit. Before he was killed, 5th Pioneers First Lieutenant Harry Martin led a counterattack, saved 2 soldiers, and suffered 2 wounds. He received a Medal of Honor posthumously. The campaign's final one was this one. The most Medals of Honor awarded for a single fight in Marine Corps history totaled 27. It was over before sunrise. More than 250 enemy corpses were recovered, and 18 more were captured. 9 pioneers were killed, and 31 wounded. There were 88 injured and 44 killed airmen. Although Kuribayashi's body was never found, there were many rumors that he personally commanded the raid. Before long, the U.S. on Iwo Jima, the 147th Infantry of the Army, assumed garrison duty. Long after the conflict ended, Japanese survivors were taken prisoner. Some drank their own urine and survived on food scraps. Just 1,083 enemy soldiers made it out alive, with 68-21 Marines dead, 19,217 injured, and 6,648 cases of combat exhaustion. The casualties were devastating. Chaplain Roland B. Gittleson's remarks, "Thus do we memorialize those who, having ceased living with us, now live within us, are a suitable tribute to those who made the ultimate sacrifice. In this way, we dedicate ourselves to continuing the fight they started. We cannot allow this earth to remain bare because too much blood has been shed on it. The ground we stand on has been fertilized by too much suffering and anguish. Here, we firmly promise that this will not be in vain. We guarantee that a new freedom for all men's sons will emerge from this, as well as from the anguish and grief of those who grieve it." Al Hemingway is a U.S. author, Vietnam War veteran of the Marine Corps. He lives in Waterbury, Connecticut, and is an authority on the island where he fought during World War II in the Pacific.